So, good morning class. Ngayong araw, pag-uusapan natin ang evolution of populations. Ito ang pangatlong bahagi ng ating video series tungkol sa evolution and biodiversity. So, una, pag-usapan natin genetic variation. So, genetic variation refers to differences among genomes of members of the same species. So, a genome is all the hereditary information, all the genes of an organism. So, for an instance, the human genome contains somewhere between 20 and 25,000 genes. And genes, based dun sa previous topics natin, di ba? Natatandaan nyo si Mendel, genes are units of hereditary information, and they carry instructions for building proteins. The genes that are encoded within these proteins are what enable cells to function. So most organisms that reproduce sexually have two copies of each gene, because each parent cell of organism donates a single copy of its genes to its offspring. Additionally, genes can exist in slightly different forms called alleles, which further adds to genetic variation. The combination of alleles of a gene that an individual receives from both parents determines what biologists call the genotype for a particular trait, such as hair texture, hair color, eye color, the color of the complexion. Ayan, there are too many to mention. Okay, so the genotype that an individual possesses for a trait in turn determines the phenotype, the observable characteristics, such as whether that an individual actually ends up, for example, having a straight, wavy, or a curl hair. If we are going to talk about hair texture. Okay, so genetic variation within a species can result from a few different sources. So meron tayo iba-ibang sources ng genetic variation. It could be mutations. So mutations, these are the changes in the sequences of genes and DNA. So, ayan, just to mention one. So, ayan. Ito po, pag-uusapan natin yung mga nagko-cause ng genetic variation. So, una na nga sa pag-uusapan natin ay mutations. Okay. So, evolution is the process by which populations of organisms change over generations. So, ang evolution ay mabagal na proseso kung saan may nagaganap na pagbabago sa isang populasyon. At yung pagbabagong ito, madalas ang ginugugol niyang panahon ay napakahaba na nag-i-span siya into several generations para maobserbahan talaga natin yung pagbabagong yun. Now, genetic variations underlie these changes. So, genetic variations can arise from gene mutations or from genetic recombination. So, madalas na natin narinig ang gene mutation. Pero, I think yung recombination, medyo hindi nyo pa alam. So, ang genetic recombination is a normal process in which genetic material is rearranged as a cell is getting ready to divide. Now, these variations often alter gene activity or protein functions, which can introduce different traits in an organism. If a trait is advantageous and helps the individual survive and reproduce, the genetic variation is more likely to be passed to the next generation. So, it is also a process known as the natural selection. Kapag advantageous yung trait na naman ng isang organism, most likely, may papasa niya yun sa kanyang magiging supling. Okay, over time, as generations of individuals with the trait continue to reproduce, the advantageous trait becomes increasingly common in a population, making the population different from an ancestral one. So sometimes the population becomes so different that it is considered a new species. However, not all mutations lead to evolution, only hereditary mutations. And it occurs in egg or sperm cells. It can be passed to future generations and potentially contribute to evolution. So some mutations occur during a person's lifetime, and only some of the body's cells and are not hereditary. So natural selection cannot play a role. Also, many genetic changes have no impact on the function of gene or protein and are not helpful or harmful in addition to the environment in which a population of organisms lives is integral to the selection of traits. Some differences introduced by mutations may help an organism survive in one setting but not in another. So for example, resistance to a certain bacteria is only advantageous if the bacteria is found in a particular location and harms those who live there. So why do some harmful traits like genetic diseases persist in populations instead of being removed by natural selection? So, importanteng tanong to. So bakit kaya? 'Di ba? Sa kabila ng natural selection, marami pa din ang genetic diseases and nagpe-persist siya. There are several possible explanations, but in many cases, the answer is not clear for some conditions such as the neurological condition, Huntington's disease. Signs and symptoms do not occur until a person has children, so the gene mutation can be passed on despite being harmful for other harmful traits. A phenomenon called reduced penetrance. Kung natatandaan nyo yung discussion natin about Huntington's disease, in which some individuals with a disease-associated mutation do not show signs and symptoms of the conditions can also allow harmful genetic variations to be passed to future generations. For some conditions, having one mutated copy of a gene in each cell is advantageous, while having two mutated copies causes disease. So the best studied example of this phenomenon is sickle cell anemia. So having two mutated copies of the HBB gene, so ito yung gene na nagko-cause nung sickle cell anemia. Kapag nag-mutate yung HBB gene, so magkaka-sickle cell. So having two mutated copies of the HBB in each cell results in the disease. But having only one copy provides some resistance to malaria. So, dalawang copy nung HBB gene na mutated, sickle cell anemia. Pero kapag isang copy lang yung na-inherit, resistance to malaria yung makukuha. So this disease resistance helps explain why mutations that cause sickle cell diseases are still found in many populations, especially in areas where malaria is prevalent. So tingnan natin dito. So we have here a population. So ngayon, nagkaroon tayo ng random mutation wherein yung isa nagbago, di ba? Now, itong pagbabagong ito dito sa egg and sperm, sa genetic material ng egg and sperm, ay heritable. So, nag-play pa din yung natural selection dito. And as a result, na-inherit siya nung mga offspring. Now, if this offspring procreates, most likely that the mutated gene will be part of the new gene pool na meron yung mga organisms na to. Now, for non-random mating, in all human populations, for example, people usually select mates non-randomly for traits that are easily observable. So, cultural values, social rules, preferences, they are primarily guide mate selection. So, most commonly, mating is with similar people in respect to traits such as skin color, stature, and personality. So, ganun. Now, for animals naman, so, halimbawa, animal breeders. So, animal breeders do essentially the same thing when they intentionally try to improve varieties or create new ones by carefully making sure that mating is not random. So, ayan. When they select mates for their animals based on desired traits, farmers hope to increase the frequency of those traits in future generations. And so far as the discriminated traits are genetically inherited, evolution is usually a consequence. However, the results are not always what farmers expect. The reason why will be explained shortly. So even without the intervention of farmers, most animals select mates carefully. They do not mate randomly. So Charles Darwin noted this fact in his 1971 book, Descent of Man and Selection. So he suggested that mate selection is a powerful force of evolution, similar in its effect to natural selection. This idea was widely rejected in Darwin's time, but later research showed that he was correct. Ayan, meron tayong mga preferences, di ba? Ayan. So, yung mga preferences na yan, they play a vital role when we try to select possible mates, both for human behavior and para din sa animal behavior, di ba? Meron tayong mga preferences. Halimbawa, sa animals, mga birds of paradise, usually magaganda yung feathers nila, or meron silang courtship dance, or meron silang serenades. So, yung mga lalaki, they try to woo the female using elaborate acts and displays of their traits. So, ganun. So, parang ganun din naman sa tao, di ba? Kapag nanliligaw tayo, when we try to woo women, so we put our best foot forward in hopes that they will also find us attractive. So, ganun klase. Now, there are two types of mating. We have assortative mating and desortative mating. Now, for assortative mating, preference for similar genotypes or phenotypes. So, parehas kayo ng hobbies, parehas kayo ng interest, parehas kayo ng halos lahat ng traits. Ayan. Assortative mating yung type ng mating kapag siya yung sinelect mo. Yung kaparehas mo ng traits or nuances. This assortative mating naman kapag yung preference mo ay ibang-iba dun sa mga traits na meron ka. So, preference for different genotypes or phenotypes yung nasa disassortative mating. Now, let's talk about gene flow. Gene flow is also called migration. So, it is a movement of individuals or the genetic material that they carry from one population to another. Now, gene flow includes lots of different kinds of events, such as pollen being blown to a new destination or people moving to new cities or countries. So, if gene versions are carried to a population where those gene versions previously did not exist, gene flow can be a very important source of genetic variation. So in the graphic below, the gene version for the black coloration of bug migrate to a new population. Population that is entirely composed of white colors, or white color rather. Ngayon, magiging importante source ng genetic variation itong individual na to, since siya yung nagdadala ng black color variant. So, siya yung mag-i-introduce ng trait na to sa isang population na to. Ayan. So example, tayong mga Pinoy. So, minsan kapag meron tayong mga kapwa Pinoy or kahit nga kapamilya na nagtatrabaho sa abroad, nakapag-single pa sila. Ayan. Usually, or minsan, nakakatagpo sila doon ng mapapangasawa or doon na sila magpapamilya. So, yung genetic variation ng mga Pinoy, pwede nating may introduce sa ibang lahi. So, ayan. So, ganun klaseng gene flow ang mangyayari. Now, there are challenges para magkaroon talaga ng successful migration or gene flow. Now, one of those challenges is the geographic barrier. So, mahirap mag-migrate or mahirap pumunta sa ibang geographic location kung saan nandun yung ibang population if merong physical barrier na nakadlang sa'yo. For example, isang mountain pass or isang mountain terrain or range. Yan. So, yung isang population, mahihirapan siyang pumunta dun sa other population unless meron siyang corridor na tinatawag or meron siyang dadaanan or merong pass. Okay. Merong tinatawag na corridors. If merong corridors, it will enable individuals of a population to get through and be introduced to another population. Just simply looking at this picture, we can see here that the western deer population, they were able to access the pass in the mountain range and mingle with the eastern deer population. So the light brown colored variation will be introduced to the dark brown color of the eastern deer population. Ayan. Ngayon, pag-usapan naman natin ang genetic drift. So, genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution in which allele frequencies of a population change over generations due to chance or sampling error. So, familiar naman na kayo sa sampling error. For example, ayan, sa isang 100 times na coin cost, diba? Usually, ang in-expect natin ay 50-50% chance. But there are times na merong tayong random sampling error. Diba? Hindi tayo tutumpak dun sa 50% chance na heads, hindi din tayo tutumpak sa 50% chance sa tail. So, meron tayong discrepancies. So, minsan mababa, minsan mas mataas. So, ito yung mga sampling error na tinatawag natin. So, genetic drift occurs in all populations of non-infinite size. So, therefore, finite population size. But its effects are strongest in small populations. Okay? So, ayan. Small population frequency and ayan, of other alleles. So, para mas may paliwanag siya, gagamitin natin to. Ayan, so sa genetic drift, meron tayong tinatawag na bottleneck effect. So yung bottleneck effect, it's a random event causes a drastic decline in the population and a reduction of the total genetic diversity. Ayan, so kung makikita nyo dito sa ating bottle, makikita nyo na meron siyang mga white, meron siyang blue and yellow marbles. So ayan, this marbles represents the population and the variation of traits that the population have. So, merong white, merong blue, merong yellow. However, meron tayong isang event kung saan nabawasan yung population at a drastic decline in the population. Ngayon, yung bote natin, meron siyang narrow na opening, di ba? Now, imagine na titilt natin yung bote and ilalagay natin yung marble sa isang container. And yung mga nailagay natin dun sa container na yun, siya lang yung mga population na nakasurvive. Okay. Since narrow yung passage dun sa bottleneck, so kaunti lang ng population yung maisasalba natin. And usually, hindi varied yung makukuha natin na diversity. Okay? So, kaya dito, diba, nagkaroon tayo ng bottlenecking event. And yung makikita natin dito na surviving population ay blue and white. So, sa case nito, mas madami yung blue and meron lang tayong 1/6 na population ng white. So, yung mga yellow, natanggal sila. So, nagkakaroon ng decline sa population and meron siyang epekto sa variation. Okay, nababawasan yung genetic diversity. So, an example of this is the bottleneck effect in the northern elephant seals. So, the northern elephant seals have reduced genetic variation probably because of population bottleneck humans inflicted on them in 1890s. Ayan. So, hunting reduced their population size to as few as 20 individuals at the end of the 19th century. So, their population has since rebounded to over 30,000, but their genes still carry the marks of this bottleneck. So, they have much less genetic variation than a population of southern elephant seals that was not so intensely hunted. So, dito meron tayong dalawang population. Isang population ay yung northern elephant seals and yung isa naman ay southern elephant seals. Now, yung northern elephant seals, sila yung nakaranas ng rampant na hunting. So, as a result, kaunti lang yung nakasurvive dun sa population. So, since madami yung namatay, nabawasan din yung genetic diversity. Now, several generations after that harmful event, so nag-rebound na yung population nila, 30,000. Pero, yung genetic variation na meron sila ay kakaunti. Kakaunti compared sa mga relative nila na southern elephant seals na hindi masyadong na-hunt. Okay? So, yan yung epekto ng bottleneck. Now, another type of genetic drift is the founder's effect. So, in here, we have an original population. Now, a part of the original population decided to leave the location, the geographic location of the original population, and they decided to migrate to an isolated area. Okay, for example, ito nga. So, itong grupo na to, they decided to leave the original population. So, kaya siya tinawag na founder effect kasi itong mga umalis na individuals na to, sila yung naging founder ng another population. So, ayan. And itong mga founding population na to, they procreate and pass on their genes, their genetic information to their descendants. Now, as you notice here, ayan, kung ano yung taglay na genetic variation ng founding population, yun din yung nakuha ng mga descendants. Especially if the founding population have a strict policy in terms of their mating habits. For example, they were the community or the population only have limited options in terms of deciding who they are going to mate with. And usually, within their own population din lang naman yung mga kamate ng mga individuals. So, kaya, yung nakuha nilang genetic variation ay nanggaling din lang naman sa founding population. So, halimbawa, mga Hamish people. So, they were people from Germany. They decided to migrate to US. And they have Hamish community in there. And, kumbaga, nagkaroon ng inbreeding dun sa Hamish community. So, sila-sila lang. So, as a result, walang masyadong genetic diversity kung ano yung genes nung Hamish people noon ay yun din naman yung genetic diversity or variation na meron yung Hamish people ngayon. So, it's because of their behavior, their preferences na ganun yung nangyari. In 1814, 15 British colonists founded a settlement on Tristan de Cunha Islands in Atlantic Ocean. One of the colonists carried a recessive allele for retinitis pigmentosa. Of the 240 descendants, 4 had retinitis pigmentosa. Ayan. So another concern for communities that have founders effect, or populations with founders effect, is that genetic diseases are rampant. Ayan. Since sila-sila din lang naman yung nag-mate, yung allele or yung genetic information na harmful or disadvantageous ay nag-circulate din lang naman dun sa community. Ayan. So, pasa-pasa, ika nga. Ayan. Now, pag-usapan naman natin ang natural selection. Na madali lang naman ang natural selection, di ba? If there is a pressures na tinatawag natin. Okay? Environmental pressures. Environmental pressures can be form of the environment itself or other organisms residing in that environment. So, for example, here we have population of light-colored or white-colored bugs and black-colored bugs. And the environment is dark. And yung mga predator, syempre, yung una nilang makikita kapag mag-hunt sila ng prey ay yung mga white-colored. Syempre. So, yung mga dark-colored na beetles, makakapag-camouflage sila, makakapagtago sila since dark yung environment. Advantageous yung dark color na yun sa traits na meron sila. Pero yung white-colored, disadvantageous. So, as a result, magkakaroon tayo ng shift sa population sa susunod na generation. Kung makikita nyo dito sa sunod na generation, mas madami na yung mga black-colored compared sa white-colored. So, yun ang epekto ng natural selection. Dapat advantageous yung trait para sa next generation, mas mag-proliferate or mas maipasa pa yung trait na yun. Yung mga organisms na may disadvantageous na trait, sila yung mga organisms na kaunti yung population usually. So, ayan. Okay, and that's it. Thank you for listening. And pasensya na, ito lang yung nagawa ko ngayon. And medyo mahirap gumawa ng magandang PowerPoint, lalo na't brown out and kakabagyo pa lang. So hopefully, at least matulungan ko kayo sa inyong studies. So ayan po. So salamat sa pakikinig.